Good afternoon, and welcome to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on this lovely June afternoon. I think we're all glad the weather seems to be clearing up. My name's David Stewart. I'm responsible for many of the conferences and courses that are held here in this auditorium and around the campus at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory each year. This is in addition to the world-class research that we do in cancer, brain science, plant biology, and genomics. The laboratory attracts scientists from all over the world to our meetings and courses, and we currently have scientists staying here learning the latest in fields ranging from bacterial genetics to single-cell analysis to autism spectrum disorders. So it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon for the 2013 Lorraine Grace Lecture on Societal Issues of Biomedical Research. This lecture is made possible by an endowment gift from Mrs. Grace, for whom the auditorium is named, in honor of Jim Watson's 80th birthday. Our last speaker in the series was Dr. Richard Leakey, who spoke about how human evolution has shaped ethics and morality. Each lecture is intended to address an area of biomedical research where ethics and science intersect. Dr. Paul Offit is an outstanding choice for the 2013 Grace Lecture. He, perhaps more than anyone, demonstrates the twin commitments of both doing outstanding science and also engaging the public about distinguishing between good science, bad science, and even pseudoscience. To my mind, he is one of a handful of citizen scientists, and we need many more of such individuals as the world becomes ever more complex. Dr. Offit is the chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases and the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He has published more than 150 papers in medical and scientific journals on rotavirus immune responses and vaccine safety. He is in fact the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, Rotatech, recommended for universal use in infants by the Center for Diseases Control. For this achievement, Dr. Offit received awards from the University of Pennsylvania, the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases, and was honored by Bill and Melinda Gates during the launch of their foundation's Living Proof Project for Global Health. He received the American Academy of Pediatrics Presidential Certificate for Outstanding Service. Some of his other awards include the Humanitarian of the Year Award from the Biologics Industry Organization, the Odyssey Award from the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest, and he's in fact a member of the prestigious Institute of Medicine. He's been a member of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices and is on the board of the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research. And, relevant to this lecture, he is also the author of 5 medical narratives, including Vaccinated, One Man's Quest to Defeat the World's Deadliest Diseases, which was published in 2007 and for which he won an award from the American Medical Writers Association. A second book, Autism's False Prophets, Bad Science, Risky Medicine, and the Search for a Cure, was published in 2008. Deadly Choices, How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All, was published in 2011. And most recently, in fact to be published next week, his new book on Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. Now, this isn't yet available, but I gather in today's London Guardian, there was an extract, and then tomorrow there'll be an op-ed piece that Paul may tell you a little bit more about in the New York Times. So his lecture this afternoon reflects the title of his most recent book, and so we look forward to hearing about alternative medicine, sense, and nonsense.
Thanks. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. My expertise is actually in vaccines, but I sort of came to this. And can you see this okay? Do we need to turn down the lights more for you to see this better? Or you're good? I'm the head of the Therapeutic Standards Committee at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, and we are constantly trying to deal with alternative medicine in our hospital, specifically people who, for example, bring in cancer medicines from Houston called anti-neoplastines, which are purified from human urine. We have dietary supplements that people want to use. Recently, there was a a nurse who was complaining to me that she was having trouble getting this fluid down through the nasogastric tube of one patient. And I asked her what that fluid was. She said, it was an antibody preparation that the parent had bought off the internet. So we're constantly dealing with this. And I thought it would be, that's actually what got me interested in the subject of alternative medicine. Although I would argue actually there's no such thing as alternative medicine. There's only medicine, if a medicine works, it's not an alternative, and if it doesn't work, it's not an alternative. So we'll go through some of the science that supports or doesn't support these alternative therapies. So we're going to start with the nonsense, and then we'll get to the sense later. I think the first point is that a lot of the alternative therapies that I'm going to go through, the sort of biological or anatomical basis of those therapies, are really fanciful. They're built on sand. We'll start with acupuncture. So this is something from early acupuncture. Actually, acupuncture didn't quite start this early. It was a little later. It was born in China in the 2nd century BC. Now, this was a culture that not only didn't believe in dissection, they didn't tolerate dissection. If you were found to have dissected a human person, you were punished by death. So they knew really very little about human anatomy. They didn't know where the brain was. They didn't know where the spinal cord was. They certainly didn't know about the peripheral nervous system. They believed that the body consisted of 365 separate components because there were 365 days of the year. They also believed that the key to good health was based on balancing yin and yang, these two competing forces, which would then allow the free flow of the body's energy called qi. Now, in order to do that, what they did was they placed these needles, these very thin needles, underneath the skin. And they would be inserted anywhere from 1/2 to 4 inches, and they would remain in place for anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. Now, the manner in which they inserted those needles was along something called meridians, which were these longitudinal arcs that ranged from the head to the toe. And the reason that they chose 12 meridians is that there are 12 great rivers in China. This is a picture of one of the meridians. So, the question then becomes, is acupuncture accurate? And so now there are people who definitely benefit from acupuncture. And so and I'm not saying acupuncture doesn't work, by the way. I'm questioning why it works. And we'll get to why it works a little later in this talk, because I think for some people it clearly does work. The question is, what does it have to do with needles being put under the skin? And so if you look at people who clearly benefit and you assign them into one of two groups, and either you insert the needles according to the acupuncture points, or you just insert those needles randomly, they equally benefit. Similarly, if you take the needle and just insert it slightly under the skin, too superficial to have tapped into what the Chinese would have considered the meridian, it still works. And more recently, there's a researcher named Edzer Ernst, who's at the University of Exeter in England, who came up with a brilliant idea of using a retractable needle. So you actually would feel the prick of the needle, but it actually never went under the skin. And they too benefited. So it's not to say that acupuncture doesn't work. It just has nothing to do with putting needles under the skin. Next is chiropractic. That was founded in the late 1800s by this man, Daniel David Palmer, who was a mesmerist. He believed that magnets treated diseases, but his moment, or the crack heard round the world, occurred in 1895, after he claimed to have cured a man of deafness following manipulation of the spine. He believed that the man's spinal column was out of order. It needed to be put back in place. And so he did that, and the man then, according to Daniel Palmer, recovered his deafness, which is remarkable considering that the 8th cranial nerve, which is the nerve that's responsible for conducting impulses that one hears through the ear, then back into the brain, doesn't travel through the neck. But in any case, he then sort of took the next illogical step, which was to believe that all diseases were caused by misaligned spinal columns, what he called subluxations. So this is a picture, if you look on the left, is a normal spinal column, and on the right you can see that one of those vertebrae are out of line, so-called subluxation. And so if you look in a modern chiropractic text, you can find pictures like this, where basically you can manipulate the spine to treat any disease, including pneumonia or bronchitis or pancreatitis or diabetes or gallbladder problems, which is, of course, fanciful. Because all diseases aren't caused by misaligned spines, prospective studies have shown that chiropractic manipulations don't treat the headaches they are claimed to treat, or menstrual pain, colic, asthma, or allergies. The next, and probably to me the most outlandish of these therapies, is homeopathy. That was discovered by this man, Samuel Hahnemann, in 1790. Now, here's the thinking behind homeopathy. Hahnemann was chewing on cinchona bark when he developed the fever. Now, cinchona bark contains quinine. Quinine is a treatment for malaria, and malaria is a disease that causes fever. So he thought those two things were related, that I'm chewing on cinchona bark, that causes fever, and that treats a disease that also causes fever. And thus was born the notion of like curing like. So and that's where the word homeopathy comes from. The word homeopathy literally means similar suffering. So for example, if you want to treat someone who has a vomiting illness, then you give them an emetic, which is to say a drug that causes vomiting. If you want to treat them for diarrhea, then you give them a purgative, which is a drug which causes diarrhea. Which brings us to the next step, because it's a little hard to sell that. What he did then was he took the second pillar on which homeopathy stands, which is the law of infinitesimals, which is to say that you dilute that emetic or that purgative out to the point that essentially it's not there anymore. Now, to his defense, actually, he wrote his seminal text. The seminal text of homeopathy was written in 1796. It was called the Organon. That was about 15 years before Avogadro came up with the number for how many molecules would exist in a mole, 10 to the 23rd. So he didn't know that. This was still 15 years before that, although homeopaths certainly know that now. This Avogadro's number seems to have stood the test of time for the last 200 years. So the notion that you can dilute something out to the point that it's not there anymore and still have any kind of active ingredient is silly. The homeopaths will argue that the water will remember that it's been there. But given that there's a limited amount of water on Earth, you don't want it to remember where it's been. It's comforting to know that it doesn't remember where it's been. And I think probably of all the alternative therapies, homeopathy has been the easiest to make fun of, which is, and I'll show you that in a second, but I'll give you a perfect example of a homeopathic remedy. This one is called oscillococcinum. It's actually available at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Pharmacy on the first floor of our hospital. Here you can see that it is claimed to treat the symptoms of flu, which include fever, chills, body aches, and pains. It's 3 doses, you can see there in the lower left-hand corner. Those 3 doses sell for $9 total, so it's $3 per dose for nature's #1 flu medicine. What is oscillococcinum and how is it made? Here's how it's made. You take a Burberry duck, you kill it, you remove its liver and heart. You then take that liver and heart and homogenize it and dilute it 1 to 100. Okay? Then you take that 1 to 100 dilution and you dilute it 200 more times. So it's basically 10 to the minus 400. The duck's gone. There is not a single molecule of that duck left. In fact, if you diluted it into the volume of the universe, which is roughly 3 times 10 to the 80th cubic meters, you would be hard-pressed to find the duck there either. So that's why this is so easy to make fun of. This is from the Center for Inquiry in Canada. This, for example, would be a homeopathic bicycle. Although my favorite one is this one, which is this is a homeopathic contraception. So, naturopathy. So naturopathy is based on the notion that nature is good, that all of these products that are sold in the GNC Center as dietary supplements are made by elves and sugar plum fairies on meadows that are flowered like this one. And so the notion is that natural is good and that man-made is bad. Now, this, by the way, is something I don't agree with. I mean, natural isn't always good. So, for example, Ebola virus, volcanic eruptions, meningitis, polio, dysentery, Alzheimer's disease, ticks, mosquitoes, the Black Death, fleas, cavities, lice, and smallpox are all natural phenomenon. And man-made isn't always bad. Spectacles, antibiotics, vaccines, artificial knees, heart transplants, and the mute button on the remote control devices for television are man-made. I think the inventor of that and the swing-o-matic, whoever those people were, should definitely win the Nobel Peace Prize. The other thing is that small compounding pharmacies are good and that big pharma is bad. David actually, I think, mentioned that there was actually an excerpt of a book that I've written called Do You Believe in Magic, which was excerpted in The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, and it came out this morning. And there were like 500 comments to that article. Basically, the point of view is that by my calling into question the fact that large dose vitamins and some of these dietary supplements can be harmful, that I was somehow a shill for the pharmaceutical industry, which doesn't make those products because they're made by elves in meadows. But actually, who do people think makes these products? These products are made by big pharmaceutical companies. This is a $34 billion a year business. So the only difference between that and drug makers is that because the Food and Drug Administration does not supervise, does not license these products, they are really under no obligation to support their claims or admit their harms. So let's take estrogen, for example. Certainly women in menopause suffer the fact that they no longer produce estrogen and progesterone, and with that comes symptoms. And so one was interested in preventing those symptoms or treating those symptoms with a hormone replacement therapy. Unfortunately, hormone replacement therapy ran into trouble when it was found to increase diseases like breast cancer. But this is an example of estrogen made by a pharmaceutical company, specifically Wyeth. There is a revolution actually in the treatment of menopause called bioidentical hormones. I don't know if you've heard this, but Suzanne Summers promotes this a lot. And the thinking here is that let's not have our pharmaceutical companies make estrogen, let's have small compounding pharmacies make it. And so we'll take wild yams, which contains diosgenin, which can be a precursor to estrogen, and then we'll synthesize estrogen from that. But what the FDA now is interested in doing is really trying to regulate this because estrogen is estrogen. It doesn't matter what the ancestry of a molecule is. It doesn't matter what the source of a molecule is. The only thing that matters is the structure of that molecule, and it's indistinguishable whether estrogen is derived originally from wild yams or, in the case of Premarin, from horse's urine. Actually, that's where the word comes from. Premarin is pregnant mare's urine. The other thing is that nature is on one side and chemicals are on the other. I'm actually glad that there are some older people in this crowd because I think you're going to appreciate this. Whatever happened to the word chemical? I mean, remember the word chemical wasn't always meant to be a bad thing. This is from a magazine that was put out by DuPont when they would say things like better living through chemistry. You could never say that today. Chemistry is a bad word. But what is this? So I'm going to show you the picture on the next slide of what this is. The substance that I'm about to show you contains benzene, methanol, acetaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide. All of these substances are highly toxic in large quantities. This is chicken soup. And that doesn't actually count the hormones from the chicken. Now remember, it's always a matter of dose. I mean, as Paracelsus said in the 16th century, the dose makes the poison. That's still true. I mean, we in our bodies now have heavy metals like mercury and beryllium and thallium and arsenic. We just have them at levels that are so low that they don't harm us. So what's this? This contains acetaldehyde, benzaldehyde, benzene, benzopyrene, and all the things that you see listed there. Many of these substances are known carcinogens or DNA-altering chemicals. This would be organic coffee. So, if human anatomy isn't based on rivers in China or days in the year, and all diseases aren't caused by misaligned spines, and homeopathic remedies don't contain any active ingredients, and the molecular structure of natural drugs is indistinguishable from synthetic drugs, then why do so many people swear by acupuncture, chiropractic, homeopathy, and naturopathy? And I think the reason is, and this gets us to the sense of this subject, the placebo response, which is unfortunately, I think, has a bad name. I think that, that there is something to be said for placebo medicine, and we'll get to that in a second. So placebo is derived from the Latin meaning I will please. It was actually first described during World War II when a nurse ran out of morphine, and when she was then instructed to take care of these wounded soldiers on the field, she simply said that the salt water that she was giving them was morphine. And found that a number of soldiers experienced pain relief. So this was striking. It was really the first time people had made this observation. And it brought up the question then, is the placebo response physiological or psychological? Or said another way, were those soldiers really experiencing the same amount of pain, but just tolerating it less, or did they actually experience less pain? So the first sort of studies on this were based on the notion that the placebo response was simply psychological. And there are a number of studies that have looked at this. This is one done by MIT researchers who tested the capacity of 2 sugar pills to relieve pain. One group was told that the pill cost $2.50, the other that it cost 10 cents. The group that was told the pill was more expensive experienced less pain. There's something to be said for spending a lot of money for something. And many studies have shown that a doctor's attitude, demeanor, clothes, and phrasing make a difference. Patients do better when doctors say you will be better soon or these pills will help you than if they say I don't know what you have or I don't know if pills will help. And this has been a well-studied phenomenon. Or as J.N. Blau said, the doctor who fails to have a placebo effect on his patient should become a pathologist. And there's another example. I don't know if any of you are baseball fans. I guess I'll find out how many of you are baseball fans. Who is that? Hamels. Thank you. Very good. I gave this talk once to about 40 medical students, and not in Philadelphia, and not one of them knew who this person was. So what you'll notice is something around his neck that you'll find actually in about 70% of baseball players. That necklace. What is that necklace? It's a titanium necklace. And it is his belief, as is the belief of many people who play baseball, that that titanium necklace is sort of giving him extra energy because it's emitting an electromagnetic force. That's what would be his explanation. That's many of their explanations. Now, titanium can conduct electricity. I mean, which is to say, when an electron moves from one atom to the next. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a force generating that phenomenon, either as a chemical force, a battery, or a mechanical force, a generator. Absent that force, this necklace is inert. It doesn't matter whether he wears a necklace made of titanium or garlic or wood. It would have the same effect. I mean, what amazes me about this actually is that these are the same athletes that climb into MRI machines, which emit sort of an electromagnetic force roughly 60,000 times that of the Earth's electromagnetic force. I mean, if this titanium necklace exhibited any of that sort of force that he claims, his body would explode when he went into an MRI machine. And then I think there's sort of the ultimate example of a placebo response, which was this movie, The Wizard of Oz. I mean, the scarecrow wanted a brain, and he wanted to be smarter. The wizard couldn't give him a brain, but he gave him the next best thing, which was a diploma. And when he got that diploma, he instantly recited the Pythagorean theorem and said, "Oh joy, oh rapture, I have a brain." He was smarter because he felt smarter. Although I don't know if you remember this movie, there was one scene right around here when Dorothy says to the Scarecrow, "You know, Scarecrow, I think I'm going to miss you most of all." And when I was little, I thought that was a nice thing to say. You know, but the Tin Man and the Lion were standing right there. I mean, it's just little manners. Maybe we should get manners from the wizard. No, okay. Probably the best example, actually, of the notion that the placebo effect is psychological was a study actually that was recently reported in the New England Journal of Medicine by Ted Kapchuk, who's a alternative therapist actually associated with Harvard. And what he did was he took 4 groups of people, or took people with asthma and divided them into 4 groups. And he gave them a series of 4 therapies. One was albuterol, which is a bronchodilator, and so which helps people with asthma breathe easier. Or he gave them sort of the same thing, gave them an inhaler that contained just salt water. Or he did acupuncture, or again, the sham acupuncture, which is when you get the needles, but it never goes under the skin. What he found was that the only thing that worked in these people, and FEV just means forced expiratory volume, which is to say you breathe out till as far as you can breathe out, and then you just see how much more you can breathe out. It's sort of a test of air trapping. Asthmatics have a problem with air getting trapped in their lungs. And what he found was that the only people who really benefited were those who had received albuterol. But interestingly, when asked to subjectively evaluate how they had thought they did, all of them basically thought they had done better in the same manner. So again, it didn't sort of jibe with actually what was an objective look at their ability to breathe out. I think more recently, people have started to focus on the physiological basis of the placebo response, which is really what I want to talk about now, because I think that's where the money is, frankly, with these alternative therapies. In the 1970s, 2 men, Rabbi Simontoff and Solomon Snyder, discovered endorphins. These are endogenous opiate agonists produced in the pituitary gland and hypothalamus. These are drugs that we make ourselves that enable us to experience less pain. They are pain-relieving drugs. Endo just means, is short for endogenous, which means made in the body, and then the second part, orphan, is just from morphine. And so there have been a number of studies looking at this. Probably the first one was done in 1978 by Levine, Gordon, and Fields. And what they did was they divided patients after dental surgery into two groups. After the anesthesia wore off from that dental surgery, one group received a placebo pill and the other didn't. The group receiving the placebo pill said that they experienced pain relief, and that pain relief could be blocked by naloxone, which is a blocker of endorphin. And that's what they believed then was causing that pain relief, that these patients had learned to release their own endorphins, that they're taking a pill thinking it's going to help them with their pain, and that they can actually learn to release their own endorphins. And actually, this shouldn't have been that surprising. There was a study done in the late 1800s of people who, when they were exposed to roses, when they were exposed to the pollen on roses, that they would breathe in that pollen and it would cause them to have an allergic response. Red eyes, itchy eyes, sort of hives. That response is mediated by histamine. What this researcher found was it was J.N. Mackenzie, his name was. This was the late 1800s. What he found was that he took these same people and he exposed them to an artificial rose, that they had the same symptoms, including hives, which is to say they could learn to release their own histamine. Amazing. Although I think the most amazing study in all of this was the famous Ader-Cohn study that was performed in 1975. It was done experimentally, but now there are more data in people. And they took rats, and the first group of rats they injected with sheep red blood cells, which is sort of typically what immunologists used to do in those days to see whether the animals would have an immune response. Sheep red blood cells are a foreign protein. It has a series of foreign proteins to that rat. And what they found, not surprisingly, was that the rats developed an immune response. Then they took a second group and they injected them with red cells at the same time that they orally inoculated them with saccharin-flavored water. Well, saccharin doesn't have any effect on the immune response, so not surprisingly, these rats then developed an immune response to the red cells. The third group was injected with red blood cells and saccharin-flavored water, except this time, the saccharin-flavored water had a drug called cyclophosphamide in it, which is an immune suppressive drug. And the animals, not surprisingly, didn't develop an immune response. And they inoculated these animals again and again with red cells and saccharin-flavored water that contained cyclophosphamide. Then what they did was they inoculated the same animals with red cells and saccharin-flavored water, but without the cyclophosphamide, and they didn't develop an immune response, which is to say they had learned to suppress their own immune response. That was remarkable. And actually, when this was published, nobody believed it until it was reproduced in 2 other laboratories. Similarly, there was a study by John Imboden. I actually grew up in Baltimore. This study was done by a man whose son, I was actually in my high school class, also named John Imboden. And it was reported in the Archives of Internal Medicine. It was done in 1957. He was at Hopkins, and he performed psychological tests on military recruits prior to what ended up fortuitously being, at least from his standpoint, an influenza pandemic that swept across the barracks in, this was Fort Detrick, Maryland. What he found was that there was a direct correlation between the level to which a recruit was depressed and the symptoms. That those patients who were more depressed had symptoms that lasted longer, were more severe, and actually shed virus for longer. So essentially mood determined illness. And this sort of, you sort of hear this growing up. You get sick when you want to get sick. And I think at some level then, what the alternative medicine people often call this the mind-body connection. I think that's fair. The mind is not a trivial place to be. You can, I think mood does determine illness. And then as an extension of that, research subjects have been shown that they can be trained to release their own cortisol, which can be immune suppressive, or gamma interferon, which can be immune enhancing. So people can potentially learn to upregulate or downregulate their own immune response. There's 5 books actually on the placebo response, each of which contains hundreds of studies, and some of which are excellent. It's really impressive. And there's a division now within the National Institutes of Health called the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which is now spending a lot of your tax dollars actually looking at trying to understand the physiological basis of the placebo response. This from John Milton's Paradise Lost: the mind can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. So I think that there's something to be said for placebo medicine. I think that that believing that acupuncture, chiropractic, or homeopathy are working is important and might allow for things like the release of endorphin or endogenous mediators that control pain, like endorphins or immune responses. And you could argue, for example, that the common cold is a self-limited illness. We tend to do things in medicine like give cough and cold preparations, which do nothing, frankly, to make it get better faster. If you have children, it makes them drowsier, which is an advantage, but that's about it. And certainly for young children, they can have night terrors associated with ephedrine-containing compounds, which is why the FDA has a warning against their use. Oscillococcinum given to young children will not hurt them because it's just a gram of sugar. You're paying $3 for a dose. I guess that's somewhat harmful, but you could make an argument then that there is a value to alternative therapies here. But it does raise a question. When I was little, my pediatrician, whose name was Milton Markowitz, who ultimately actually became the dean of the University of Connecticut's medical school, when he used to come to the house back in the days when people made house calls, you may remember this, when pediatricians would come to your house. I remember looking at his big black bag, which had, all this sort of interesting tubing and syringes. Also in there was this thing of pills, and I remember asking him about that, and he said they were sugar pills. And I asked him what sugar pills would be for, and he said, because it makes people think that they're getting better. And so that's the question. Is it ethical to deceive? I'd like to say, by the way, the conventional therapists also engage in some deception. In our hospital, if you walk into Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, you'll see doctors with white coats with red stenciling on them. We have nice offices. We have, big machines that make interesting noises. I think, there's a therapy in all of that. And I think, arguably, deception at low risk, low burden, and low cost is acceptable. We've sort of gotten away from this. I think my pediatrician practiced placebo medicine where he thought it would be of value, where he thought that if he's taking someone who has a cold or a viral infection, what's the point of giving something that could be harmful when this disease is going to get better anyway? But I think there are times when alternative medicine crosses the line into quackery, and that's what I want to focus on now. The first, I think, is the unappreciated harm that is caused by a number of these remedies. So, for example, acupuncture needles have been found in hearts, lungs, and livers. They've introduced viral infections such as hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and human immunodeficiency virus. At least 86 people have died from acupuncture. That probably represents actually a fairly small percentage of those who have actually died. So you could make an argument for using retractable needles. Now, I think acupuncturists might be slow to adopt this idea that I have because they would argue that that's deceiving the patient, but I would argue that this whole business about yin, yang, and bouncing chi is a deception anyway, so why not just take the next step? At least 26 people have died from chiropractic manipulations, almost solely caused by ripping the vertebral artery in the neck, including children. As I said before, dietary supplements are an unregulated industry. If you look at the 54,000 dietary supplements that are on the market, less than 0.3% have any sort of safety record. We have to deal with this in our hospital all the time for patients that bring in these kinds of medicines. Certainly it is known that blue cohosh can cause heart failure, nutmeg at high doses can cause hallucinations, comfrey, kava, chaparral, and others. Agents listed here can cause hepatitis. Monkshoot and plantain can cause arrhythmias. Wormwood can cause seizures. Stevia leaves can cause decreased fertility. Concentrated green tea extracts, which I think everyone would always assume is natural and can never hurt you, has been shown to cause liver damage in some patients. Milkweed seed oil and bitter orange can cause heart damage. Thujone can cause neurological damage. Concentrated garlic can cause bleeding. Actually, the guy who drove my taxi today from Syosset to here was telling me about how his father took alternative remedies and had a bleeding problem. And the alternative remedy he took actually was concentrated garlic, which certainly can do that. And pennyroyal and capsaicin can cause infant death. So as I said, most of these supplements have no sort of safety record because they don't have to. Because ever since 1994's Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act, this is an unregulated industry. Also, there are problems with contamination. In 2004, researchers at Harvard Medical School tested Ayurvedic or Indian remedies, the kind that are promoted by people like Deepak Chopra in Boston, finding that 20% contained potentially harmful levels of lead, mercury, and arsenic. Recently, in 2009, Kirkman Laboratories, which makes remedies, and I put that in quotes for children with autism, recalled 15,000 bottles of zinc because they contained undeclared levels of antimony. Between 1983 and 2004, poison control centers received 1.3 million reports of adverse reactions to vitamins, and I'm talking about megavitamins, meaning vitamins taken in vast excess of the recommended daily allowance, usually 5, 10, 20-fold greater. Minerals and dietary supplements, 175,000 hospitalizations and 136 deaths. I think David mentioned I have an op-ed piece actually that's coming out in tomorrow's New York Times that specifically talks about the harm of megavitamins. I mean, you know, Vita always sounds good, right? Vita, life, how could vitamins ever be bad? Certainly we need vitamins, but you can take too much vitamins. You can take enough vitamins actually, specifically A, E, beta-carotene, and selenium to increase your risk of heart disease, increase your risk of cancer, and shorten your life. And so why don't we know about this? The reason we don't know about this is that ever since 1975, the Food and Drug Administration, which tried to regulate the vitamin industry, was basically turned back by a very powerful, very financially solid, and influential industry. Second, I think is that the second place I think in which alternative medicine crosses the line into quackery is the replacement of conventional therapies with alternative therapies. So there are some conventional therapies that work where an alternative therapy wouldn't. And the poster boy for this problem is Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs had pancreatic cancer, but he didn't have the kind of pancreatic cancer that typically kills you, which is to say an adenocarcinoma. What Steve Jobs had was a neuroendocrine tumor. Neuroendocrine tumors with early surgery have a 95% chance of recovery. This was a completely treatable disease he had. But for 9 months, instead of getting the surgery he was recommended to have, what he did was he did acupuncture, he did bowel cleansings, he did megavitamin therapy, he did fruit juices and vegetable juices, and in that time that he waited, that cancer then got out of control and it was too late. Similarly, there are many stories like this. I just highlight a few here. And Linda Epping was a little girl with a tumor of the eye, rhabdomyosarcoma, that was treated with by a chiropractor with vitamins, supplements, and laxative. This was a treatable tumor, but she was dead in 3 months. There was a 9-year-old girl who was treated with shark cartilage, which was actually still popular among cancer patients. Instead of radiation and chemotherapy, was dead in 4 months. And in 2006, parents of a 6-year-old boy with asthma chose a homeopathic bronchodilator, which is to say no bronchodilator at all, instead of a real bronchodilator, and the outcome was fatal. This, interestingly, is a problem in Canada, because I know we were talking earlier, there are a couple people who were Canadian here. The phenomenon of homeopathic vaccines, which is really a contradiction in terms. So if you look at the picture on the left, it says HPV nosodes. So nosodes is what they're called. What you do is you take fluid from someone who is infected with HPV, you dilute it out to the point that there's not any virus there anymore, and then you call that a vaccine. Obviously, it has no chance of working, and this is actually a big problem in Canada. Hasn't been a problem here yet. Third, I think, is draining patients' bank accounts. I mean, there are the situations in which you see this, I think, are the most regrettable. There are parents who are desperate because their children suffer autism and will do anything, will pay anything to help them get better. This shows just 3 books from what are the many, many books on how you can cure your child's autism. And cancer, you know, there obviously are cancers which are more or less treatable. Those that are less treatable, people will often go to, to these kinds of alternative cures, which are essentially have no record of testing for either safety or efficacy. And if you look through these books, what you find is that the recommendations are all the same. So autism and cancer, although they're dramatically different diseases, seem to have the same treatments, which include megavitamins, supplements, bowel cleansing, fruit and vegetable juices, sweat lodges, hyperbaric oxygen chambers, chelation, restricted diets, chiropractic, homeopathic remedies, electrical or magnetic stimulation, probiotics, intravenous immunoglobulins, and stem cell transplants, among others. And I think there's a certain, to pick up the Wizard of Oz theme, I think there's a certain heartlessness to this. I mean, I think that when adults do these things, for the most part, for themselves, they do it with their eyes open. But I think when these alternative healers really try and capitalize on parents who are desperate to treat their children, there's a heartlessness to this. I don't know if you remember the line from this movie, but what the wizard said was, he said, "So, Tin Man, you want a heart. You don't know how lucky you are not to have one." My favorite of the alternative medicine diseases is chronic Lyme disease, because what the alternative healers have done here is made up a disease. Autism's real, cancer's real. Chronic Lyme disease, at least as defined by alternative healers, isn't. So Lyme disease is real. It's caused by a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi. That bacteria is injected into the body via the bite of a tick and undergoes a series of stages. Stage 1 is the classic bullseye rash, which can last for days or weeks. Stage 2 is characterized by fatigue, muscle aches, fever, meningitis, encephalitis, facial palsies, neuritis, carditis, inflammation of the heart, inflammation of the nerves with resolution. In stage 3, what I guess MDs would call chronic arthritis, chronic disease is arthritis, which can occur months later. But the so-called Lyme literate doctors argue that Lyme is far more than that, has far more in the way of symptoms than that. So, for example, if you look in the books that I just showed you, you get this characterization of what chronic Lyme disease could be. Read this and see whether or not you could potentially have chronic Lyme. It's characterized by weight change, hair loss, sore throat, menstrual irregularities, upset stomach, constipation, diarrhea, cough, headache, neck pain, lightheadedness, motion sickness, poor balance, wooziness, tremor, confusion, difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, mood swings, disturbed sleep, or hangovers after drinking alcohol. They just might as well take the next step and say, if you've ever bought a lottery ticket and lost, that you might have Lyme disease. But so that's chronic Lyme disease. And so the therapies associated with chronic Lyme disease, and I think these are mostly patients, when you see this, at least when it's been evaluated in any sort of thoughtful way, these are often patients who are depressed. They have chronic symptoms, and those symptoms are those of depression, which is not an easy disorder to treat. But in any case, these Lyme literate doctors are try to convince people that what they really have in their bodies are bacteria which just are invisible. That they, in fact, these bacteria don't evoke an immune response. That's why all the Lyme tests are negative. And so you need to be treated with a variety of things, one of which is malaria therapy. So in 1990, the CDC investigated 2 cases of malaria in the United States. Both patients were quite ill. Both had been infected with the same strain. Both believed that they had chronic Lyme disease. Both traveled to a clinic in Mexico to get infected with malaria, and fortunately both survived. There's also teasel, which is a common roadside weed. This is in Wolf Storr's book, Healing Lyme Disease. One takes time with the plant, sits down facing east, the direction of the rising sun, opens all one's senses regarding it. Before getting into this meditation, one can burn dried sacred herbs, prairie sage or mugwort, for example, and smudge oneself. After contacting the plant's spirit and asking for its help, one can dig out the root or harvest the leaves. And then there's the Rife machine. The Rife machine has been around for a long time and has been used for a variety of things. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but it still gets play in newspapers occasionally. But what the Rife machine does is it delivers an invisible electromagnetic field that passes through the entire body and disables targeted microorganisms. That's what it used to look like in the 1930s when it was invented by Raymond Royal Rife. Shown actually, if you can see that on the left there, standing next to one of his Rife machines. Dread disease germs destroyed by rays, claims of South Dakota scientists. He actually invented it to treat tuberculosis, but it turns out it has many uses, one of which is the treatment of chronic Lyme disease. That's what a modern day Rife machine looks like. There was recently a conference in Seattle that focused on the Rife machine. You can actually get it for as cheap as $400. They're practically giving it away at that price, so you may want to get in on that. But typically it costs about $2,000, and it's really easy. You can sit in your chair and hold the 2 electrodes. You set it, see that knob there, you set it to the setting that kills Lyme bacteria, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. We probably have about 100 trillion bacteria that's on our skin that lines our nose and throat and intestines, but this machine is actually able to just electrocute those Lyme bacteria. That is pretty good, and I think well worth the $2,000. I think the last thing is that with this, I think one promotes magical thinking. Mehmet Oz is actually, I think, a culprit here. He recently on a show, he said, they're talking about acupuncture specifically, there's just some things that science can't explain. Well, that's true. Science certainly can't explain how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. It can't answer theological questions, but it can answer scientific questions. If people are benefiting from acupuncture, if they are really experiencing pain relief, you can figure out the physiological basis of that pain relief. We may not have figured it out yet, but it is figure-outable. You don't have to look to the gods to try and explain this. One can at least try and explain it based on the physiology that we know. This was a line from Robert Slack, writing for the Center for Inquiry. The gaps in medical knowledge we all dread are not likely to be filled by energy fields, meridians, and astrology, but by the pursuit of knowledge under a single set of standards we call science. The way forward is through a careful and purposeful pursuit of scientific truth, even if it means leaving some of our most romantic fallacies behind. Or this from Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which will sort of give you a hint as to how old I am. Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too? In fairness, and I'll close with these last few slides, I think one can also ask the question, when does conventional medicine cross the line into quackery? Because the fact is, most of the diseases we see are self-limited, and yet we often choose to treat them. So we give a lot more antibiotics than we need to give for viral infections, which are self-limited and will in no sense be made better by antibiotics. And in fact, we select for resistant strains. Antibiotics, like any medicine, can have negative effects. And you could argue we're better off using homeopathic remedies, which we know won't hurt. There's no such thing as having a mood anymore. Everything is an affective disorder. There's a book out called The Death of Sadness, which is great, right? No one is sad anymore. Everybody has to have an affective disorder, which has to be treated with mood-elevating drugs. You're probably better off using Teasel or Rife machines, or crystals, or prayer. At least those aren't harmful. And there's an overuse of surgery for arthritic pain. I mean, there's a wonderful study done showing that you are no better off, this was a particular kind of arthritic pain, if you got surgery or if you got sham surgery. I mean, so people got better because they thought they were going to get better. And so you could argue chondroitin sulfate and glucosamine, which was actually offered by my orthopedist after I had recent microfracture surgery on my knee. If you look at the data, there's clear data that this doesn't make you any better, but it doesn't hurt you. And so you can argue it's certainly better than surgery. And so this from Thomas Saz: when religion was strong and science weak, men mistook medicine for magic, or men mistook magic for medicine. Now, when science is strong and religion weak, men mistake medicine for magic. So I think that there's no such thing as alternative medicine. If a medicine works, it's not an alternative. If it doesn't work, it's not an alternative. There's a name for medicine that works, and it's called medicine. I think it's incumbent on healers like acupuncturists or chiropractors or naturopaths or homeopaths to determine why a particular alternative therapy might be working. There is a reason, and so it's find-outable. And I think most importantly, alternative therapy shouldn't be given a free pass. They're always seen as something natural and benign and sort of cashes in on this anti-pharmaceutical company bias, but they should be held to the same high standards of safety and efficacy as conventional medicines. And when they're not, I think we should insist that those studies be done. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention.